Fala galera, tudo bem com vocês? Sejam todos muito bem-vindos a mais um episódio do nosso Admirável Novo podcast brasileiro. É muito bom ter vocês aqui mais uma vez nesse episódio muito especial. E a nossa convidada desse episódio é uma convidada internacional, aceitou gentilmente o nosso convite e o nome dela vou apresentar agora e falar algumas coisinhas, e logo mais o meu amigo Tiago, parceiro de podcast, estará dando continuidade com vocês sobre esses assuntos muito interessantes. Desde já a gente quer agradecer a presença dela por ter aceitado nosso convite, e ela é a professora Kristin Du Mez, autora de Jesus e John Wayne, autora Bestseller do The New York Times e professora do Calvin College. Ok? Seja muito bem-vinda. É um prazer muito grande ter você aqui. E, Tiago, por favor, contextualize melhor aí os nossos ouvintes sobre quem é a nossa professora convidada, por favor.
Muito obrigado, Book. Então, hoje o nosso episódio vai ser todo em inglês. Quem puder acompanhar, vai ter que acompanhar as legendas aqui. Mas muito obrigado, muito obrigado. So, it's our pleasure to talk to you, Professor Du Mez. It's really a pleasure. I couldn't even imagine that you would respond to our tweet, and that's something. We do this a lot. We invite a lot of people, and you are, how can I say, if this is the same expression in English, it's from far, as we say here, our greatest honor. I really wanted to talk to you. And how are you? Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm doing well, coming to you from Michigan, and where it's kind of cold and gray. And I'm just happy to be able to chat about the book and to hear how it resonates so widely in so many different spaces, and most particularly in Brazil. Ever since the book came out, I really, like, weeks after the book released, I started hearing from Brazilian evangelicals saying this is a very familiar story. So it's my pleasure.
Yes, this is a very familiar story here, since I thought I wouldn't. I thought I would avoid to say his name here, but I have to say his name here. It's a very familiar story here because it says a lot about our former president, Jair Bolsonaro.
Mhm.
And I'm not a very well-known person here in Brazil. We are a small podcast, and I'm a really, really small YouTuber here. But my most popular video is about Jair Bolsonaro, and a lot of criticism I direct to him, towards him. And was it a surprise to you, the success in Brazil?
The success of Bolsonaro, or are you talking
No,
the
your
reception of the
success,
book? Oh, the
reception
success
of
of
the
the
book.
book. Yeah, first, when you write a book like this, I'm a historian, I'm an academic, and so anytime people actually read what you spend years researching is kind of amazing. So I would say that the success in the United States first was a bit surprising. I thought it would reach a rather significant audience in academic terms, right? I had a really good publisher. We released on NPR here in the United States. We launched on Morning Edition, and so, like, it had some attention. It's talking about something current, but it actually went much bigger than anybody anticipated in the coming months. And the reason for that actually was evangelicals themselves, or former evangelicals. And there are millions in the United States, and they started reading the book. They started recognizing their own stories in the book, and they started sharing it with others. And so what happened is, I describe in the book that there's this huge evangelical subculture, right? They have their own books, they have their own movies, they have their own networks. And this book started moving along some of those networks. And so it was really word of mouth in many cases that spread this, and that actually made it a bestseller kind of in the evangelical community, and then also in the national media, because it spoke so clearly to events like January 6th in our country. So it kind of was hitting both angles. I think the same kind of thing is happening in Brazil, in that it was Brazilian evangelicals, Brazilian Christians themselves who really pushed for this book to be translated into Portuguese and to be released in Brazil. And obviously the parallels between January 6th, January 8th, between Trump and Bolsonaro mean that it's not just of personal significance to people who have kind of lived inside these spaces, but it's also has national political significance. So I think that in that case, we can see similar patterns in the United States and in Brazil.
Yes, this is very interesting because you said the January 6th events. And we have now our January 6th, but just as the book says, not the book doesn't say it directly, but we have our January 6th, but it's January 8th. And it's more than a year later.
Yeah.
And this is just terrifying, how Brazil just tries to imitate the United States in many aspects, and we import a lot of culture and a lot of aspects, even in political transactions here. And I'm a little worried. I'm a young guy. I'm yet a young guy. Uh, I have 30 years. I'm 30 years old. We say in Brazil, I have 30 years, but I know in English we say I am 30 years old. And I started studying about politics in Brazil and the evangelicals and the politics in Brazil a lot. And I found about your book, and it says a lot about us. But there are some stuff that maybe Brazilians do not know, that you speak a lot about John Wayne. John Wayne was a really big star in the United States, maybe the most famous in decades in a row. And sometimes I feel that people who read the book do not understand how great he is. But what makes really how can I say, it makes really familiar with us and very like to Brazil is that John Wayne came from three marriages, right? Two divorces, just like our former president, and some racism and some. Jair Bolsonaro is not especially racist, He said some stuff here and there, not like John Wayne, and in the John Wayne times, it was very acceptable socially. Not God never accepted it, but how what you think we have to learn from this? Because now we have your book, and sorry I'm talking too much, but now we have your book. But history is not a prophet with the eyes to the past,
No.
But
Yeah.
we should learn something. We should avoid some stuff because we have now our Biden like in the in the as a president. We have Lula again. He's very similar to Biden in some stuff.
Yeah. So let me start with the John Wayne question. Who is John Wayne, and and why is this Jesus and John Wayne? I didn't set out to write a book about John Wayne. John Wayne is, and it's not really a book about John Wayne per se, but John Wayne, iconic American actor. He really rose to fame in the 1940s, starring in westerns. He was the cowboy hero, and then he went on to star in World War II films like The Sands of Iwo Jima. He starred in The Alamo, in The Green Beret, so Vietnam War hero on screen, right? And so he just epitomized this heroic American masculinity, white, masculinity. Because if you think about all of his greatest hits, he's always kind of the white guy with a gun, and usually he's subduing non-white populations. So the Japanese in Iwo Jima, and the Mexicans in the Alamo, and Native Americans in the cowboy movies, and Vietnamese, right? And so he's this kind of extremely popular actor that then by the 70s achieves an iconic status. And by the 1970s, right, with all the disruptions of the 60s, with the feminist movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, right, all of that going on, he comes to symbolize a conservative, reactionary masculinity, a kind of return to, the good old days when white men could achieve order through violence, that kind of thing, or the threat of violence, right? So he becomes this, he's a beloved film star generally, but particularly among American conservatives, he comes to symbolize the good old days and what we need to return to in order to make America great again, really. So that's who John Wayne is. And for decades, he's just the top film star. Until quite recently, really. And he's still way up there. Now, what does that have to do with American evangelicals? Because John Wayne was not evangelical, right? He did not live this moral life that evangelicals are, kind of known for promoting. These are family values evangelicals, the moral majority. What I saw is when I first started paying attention to evangelical teachings on manhood back in the early 2000s, because I started researching this project in the early 2000s, so long ago. And I started reading these really popular books, and books that were selling like 4 million copies in evangelical spaces. Books like John Eldridge's Wild at Heart, offering blueprint for Christian manhood to evangelicals. What I saw very quickly is that there was not a lot of the Christian scriptures actually in these books, and certainly not much in the way of sophisticated theology or exegesis, or what does this really mean. Instead, these authors looked to Hollywood heroes for their models of Christian manhood. So they loved mythical warriors and cowboys and soldiers, and people like Teddy Roosevelt and George Patton and William Wallace from the movie Braveheart. Mel Gibson's William Wallace was this huge favorite. And also John Wayne, I saw kept popping in there. And I thought this is very curious, right? For all these evangelicals claim to be, Bible believing Christians. That's their self-identity. They define themselves by their biblicism, by upholding the authority of the scriptures, and many read the scriptures literally. And yet in this vast industry on what does it mean to be a Christian man, which also defines what does it mean to be a Christian, they're not actually looking to the scriptures much at all. Instead, they're pulling these heroes, these film stars, these make-believe kind of macho figures, and saying this is Christian manhood. And therefore, they end up constructing a Christianity that's very militaristic, that's very aggressive, that condones violence. And I saw how all of this, and very white, all of their heroes, of their models of Christian manhood, just happened to be white guys who would use violence to achieve order. And so I saw this, and now this was in the early 2000s when I first started paying attention. And I knew at that time we had all these surveys showing how white evangelicals in the United States were more likely than any other Americans to at that time support the Iraq War, to support preemptive war in general, to condone the use of torture, to promote aggressive foreign policy. And so I just asked, what might one of these things have to do with the other, right? And so that's the political implications. But the bigger question is this: what's the relationship between religion and culture, especially for evangelicals who deny that there's any cultural influences on their own belief? Whatever their political views, whatever their social views, they say this is just biblical. This is just scripture. We have God's truth. This is the way it is. When in fact, so many of their values are shaped by the culture that they participate in, by a political agenda. And so that's kind of the bigger takeaway of the book.
Yes, sure. Um, when I read your book, you mentioned a lot of books that I read when I was a child. That's just just incredible because I felt very like I was looking to my past shit. But don't you feel that in any culture that Christianity advances, this culture, this nation, these people start to imagining a Jesus like them?
Yes, absolutely. This is not unique to American evangelicals, right? This is if you listen to scholars of missions or to missionaries themselves, scholars of Christianity, generally, like this Christianity is always embedded, right? It's always enculturated. This is not unique to American evangelicals, but there are some distinctives when we look at white evangelicals in the United States that kind of exacerbate this. Um, First of all, they they tend to be, because they have been in a position of power, of dominance, and because they kind of occupy their own spaces. They have their own very powerful subcultures, right? So they tend to deny that their understanding of Christianity is in any way enculturated. Whereas for other kind of more minority cultures, it's you just know that you're one variation of Christianity. You know that that there are others out there. White evangelicals tend to be quite isolated and oblivious to, or there are other versions of Christianity out there, but they're all wrong, right? And so they tend to really center themselves and have this kind of hegemonic culture, have this position of social privilege in many respects. But beyond that, or related to that, they have this expansive popular culture. And so, and here I'm talking about Christian publishing industry, right? Christian publishing in the United States is absolutely dominated by evangelical publishing. And that evangelical publishing in the United States ends up dominating global markets as well. You get that, right? In Brazil, I mean, my book is published with Thomas Nelson, Brazil, which is amazing and also a little bit surprising because they also publish a lot of the books that I'm writing about and in many cases critiquing, right? But that's kind of how this works. And the evangelical power in this consumer culture, because it's Christian publishing, it's Christian radio, it's Christian television, and then it's these global ministries, these networks, these church networks, and you've got like the Gospel Coalition, right, and John Piper and Desiring God, and you've got all these networks, and they're all rooted in the United States, but then they all have global reach. None of this came by accident. I write in the book about how in the early 1940s, conservative Protestants came together and they felt marginalized because they had failed to secure control of the major Protestant denominations after the fundamentalist modernist kind of splits in the 1920s. And they hadn't disappeared like the media kind of thought they had. They had just gone off to their own churches and their own Bible colleges. But in 1942, they come together and they form the National Association of Evangelicals, right? And when they do this, they have a plan. And they say, imagine what good we could do if we band together. And we need to band together in organizations. We need to have networks for our Bible colleges. We need to get Christian publishing really up and running. We need Christian bookstores in cities and towns across the country. We need to take to the airwaves radio. And then soon after that, television comes along. And they have this plan to really use the culture to evangelize. And what's really amazing is that they accomplished this all in like 15 years. Through Billy Graham, he becomes this national celebrity, starts magazines and radio programs, and this evangelical industry just grows exponentially during this time, and it has this then position of dominance in terms of religious culture in the United States. And so that's extremely powerful. And it continues to this day, so that if you go into a bookstore and buy a Christian book, right, any kind of religious book, chances are it's going to be an evangelical one. If you want to listen to some Christian music on the radio, you know, 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, you know, except for the occasional Catholic station you might come across, it's evangelicalism. And so that means they are able to shape ideas for hundreds of millions of people. What is Christian? What is, how does a Christian behave politically? How does a Christian vote? All of that, they have such powerful control, even when it doesn't seem political, because usually this isn't like political outfacing. This is how Christians live. This is what it means to be a Christian man. This is how you raise your kids. This is how you obey God.
Yes, this is very interesting. But I like the way you talk, because you talk like a historian and you talk like a professor should. You're not just giving opinions. You're not giving opinions at all. You're just describing the history, and it leads me to a position where I just want to know your opinion. You know, what what do you think about this? Don't you think that they, in some ways, at least in some ways, it was good? They shaped a little of your culture. And in Brazil, we are the evangelicals, and you know, here in Brazil, the evangelicals are not so far from the historic Protestants. We are the same.
Yeah.
Basically, we are the same. Some other theologians here in Brazil who wants to import some Reformed theology from the United States, they eager to divide us here in Brazil, evangelicals and Protestants. But here we are the same. I wrote an article about this some weeks ago, and I really wanted to see more evangelical culture here in Brazil. But what do you think? It was good for the U.S. Or it was bad for the U.S.?
Yeah, I love this question. We could ask, is it good for the US or bad? Was it good for Christianity in the US or bad for Christianity in the US? And was it good for whom? And who was it not good for? I like that you're asking me to, like, well, what do you think? Because my default is, let me just tell you what happened and how it happened, right? And then what you want to do with it is up to you. And some people are going to say, yes, this was a really good thing, and other people are going to say this is terrible and we need to fight it. And that's kind of going to depend on how you position yourself in the story. But I think that in certain respects, I mean, there's nothing wrong, I would argue, with people, you know, living out their values, in kind of just, you know, wanting to shape their country that they find themselves in for the better, which is certainly what evangelicals would understand that they were up to, right? They want to evangelize because they're spreading the good news of the gospel. Now, they're also spreading a whole lot in addition to the gospel message, right? There's a lot of packaging that comes along with that. And but then what happens is, as this kind of religious culture grows, and it's not just amorphous. It's, you can look at certain organizations, National Association of Evangelicals, I mentioned, the Christian Booksellers Association becomes very important, the CBA, and Christian radio stations, so that now you've got these really powerful Christian radio networks like Salem, right? Caleb, you've got these, like, essentially monopolies, right? And so what we're talking about is not just people saying, hey, I want to share my faith. It's this monopoly power that means that only one version of Christianity really gets out there to the masses. And if you're a part of this, if you're a writer, if you're a musician, you're a singer, right? And you say something that these gatekeepers don't appreciate, you're not going to get any more radio time. You're not going to have your books published by these major publishers. You're not going to have them distributed through these distribution systems. You're not gonna make money. You're gonna, you know, have to find a different job, different career, essentially. So what that does then is it really, it doesn't just amplify a very narrow set of voices that align with conservative white political views, which is how this often ends up working out, but it stifles a lot of other voices, non-white voices, people who have a different understanding of the gospel and what the implications are for American society, what it means to follow Christ, what it means to work for justice and mercy in our society. And so I think that's where things get more negative, where you can see the history of evangelicalism in many ways is a history of exclusion, of who gets defined out of evangelicalism and who was never actually invited in. In the United States, you can see historically, going back to the early 20th century, say with the fundamentals, and the relationship between fundamentalism and evangelicalism is they were never completely separated. But if we just start with the early history of fundamentalism, those fundamentals, collection of books, very conservative Protestant theology, right, were sent out to pastors across the country, but not to any Black pastors, even though they shared conservative political or conservative theological views. They were just like not considered part of Christianity, not the true Christianity, the National Association of Evangelicals too. Comfortable with some white supremacists, but not with right Black evangelicals early on, anybody arguing for racial justice. So what we're seeing here is not just people promoting the gospel, but it's gatekeeping. Who is inside Christianity, right? Because they define evangelicalism as like true Christianity. So who's inside evangelicalism, true Christianity, and who is not? Which perspectives are allowed in here and which are not? And so you can just see historically over time, African American evangelical voices largely defined outside of evangelicalism, unless they 100% affirm the conservative white evangelical agenda, right? If they start talking about justice, if they start talking about systemic racism, right? No more. Looking at Christian feminists, evangelical feminism goes back, for a couple centuries. And if what we see in the 1970s is evangelical feminists largely being defined outside of the fold, and instead complementarianism, these conservative gender roles become gospel truth. The gospel coalition, right, is formed around complementarianism. So if you are an evangelical and hold to all the theological beliefs, if you consider yourself born again, but you read the scriptures, which you consider inerrant, the inerrant word of God, to teach the liberation of women, and there is a long history of that. No, sorry, you're not welcome in the gospel coalition. Then we could talk sexuality and LGBTQ, right? And you see how this works, so that it's actually a very narrow definition of Christianity and of evangelicalism that is acceptable. And anybody outside, anybody who crosses a line one way or another, actually crosses a line to the left. You can cross lines to the right. You can go as far as right as you want. You cross the line to the left and you're out, right? And then you lose access to this market. So that's really how this is working. Is this good for Christianity? I would argue not, because I'm a person of faith myself. I'm a Christian and I teach at a Christian university. And I believe that, the body of Christ is diverse, and that we need, and, Jesus commanded unity in the body. And evangelicalism is very much a history of excluding and silencing voices that do not align with the dominant agenda.
Do you consider yourself a Christian feminist?
Yeah, I would. I mean, all of these terms are kind of they become boxes, right? And so how do we define the box? Do you place yourself in that box or not? And so I always, as a historian, like to complicate things and okay, what do we mean by feminist? What do we mean by Christian feminist? Because in fact, those terms change quite dramatically over time. What do we mean by Christianity even, right? How does that change? So my first book, actually, Jesus and John Wayne, is my second book. My first book is called A New Gospel for Women, and it's about the history of Christian feminism in the late 19th and early 20th century in the United States and the transatlantic world. And so I've done a lot of research into that, and I would put myself in that tradition, in that I think that historically and theologically, there are some really strong cases to be made for interpreting Christianity and the teachings of Jesus in a way that that teach liberation for the captives, liberation for the poor, liberation for women. And so, yes, I would situate myself in that tradition and claim that title. I'm a Christian. A feminist. Now, what feminism means changed a lot, and so I would also say, okay, I would hold to these, kind of feminist teachings. Here's where I would push back, or here's where I just don't think it's the whole answer at all.
Okay, this is very nice. These days I've been thinking about studying more about your not exactly your vision, because I just knew about your first book these days when I was reading more about Jesus and John Wayne,
Yeah.
and I even picked a book from written by Beth Barr.
Yes.
Yes, and I would love to read your first book, and I'm planning to read Beth Barr book. I would love to talk to her too, and but now I promise you, I will look for your book, and I hope that we can have another conversation about the first book. Um, just just some commentaries about what you just said right now. In Brazil, feminism is not very well accepted. Not not just in the evangelical circles,
Yeah.
but everywhere.
Yeah.
And because the type of feminism here in Brazil is just this new feminism, not the not the, how can I say, in Brazil it sounds like critical, but it's not critical what I want to say. But the thinking, feminism like we have in Camille Paglia and other women. I like Camille Paglia a lot, and this is not very well accepted here in Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
I consider myself a complementarian. Is that right? This
Mm-hmm.
term?
Yep.
But I want to know more about it, and I
Mm-hmm.
I felt in your books your this path. Sometimes I felt um disturbed uh, when you just didn't give your opinion, but you are just like criticizing some masculinity models,
Yeah.
and it seems that you are very, very strongly against any kind of violence, and you don't believe in any kind of violence that is, oh, we need violence right now, because we grew up. I am a martial artist myself. I used to be a martial artist myself, and me and Book, we grew up in a very violent state in Brazil. We grew
Mm-hmm.
up in Pará. I live
Mm-hmm.
in the south of Brazil right now. It's like an European like state, Santa Catarina, but I grew up in Pará, and I was born in Amapá, uh, uh, much more in the north. And sometimes we needed to use violence to protect ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
and or we did it, or we used it, or we got beaten up, in the streets, and sometimes I got. Uh, what do you think about this? Because if I wasn't tough,
Mm-hmm.
I would end up, not me exactly, but many of us would end up killed in the streets.
Yeah.
What you think about this?
Yeah, in terms of like my own perspective, I'm not actually a consistent pacifist. I'm a bit too realist, and probably my upbringing. I mean, my own son is considering a career in the military, so what I would say is that, the things that I'm against or for in the book, broadly speaking, are I'm against abusive power and sexual abuse, right? That's maybe goes without saying, but if you're looking at, where I come out pretty strongly critiquing abuse of power, and that's the kind of the whole last chapter, and understanding how we got to that kind of state inside our Christian institutions and our Christian communities. And I'm pro-democracy. I don't think democracy is necessarily ordained by God, but I think that in our present, historical moment, that democracy is probably our best bet, and better for the health of Christianity as well. And so those are kind of my values that I put out there, and that you can see, kind of frame, what do I think is good, what do I think is bad. Now, when we get more theologically oriented around complementarianism or egalitarianism and things like that, what's interesting is that I got like none of these questions with my first book, which is, again, on Christian feminism, the history of Christian feminism, and it very much situates Christian feminism in the late 19th century in terms of economic shifts, in terms of cultural shifts, in how did these women at this time end up interpreting the scriptures in this way? How were they drawing on a longer history of Christian tradition? How were they in some cases pushing back? None of that was controversial. Now that I'm doing the same thing, situating theological, beliefs historically in terms of what's going on culturally, what are the cultural influences, but I'm describing a conservative kind of set of theological beliefs and explaining how those are also culturally dictated. That's where it gets controversial all of a sudden, in part because Christians who tend to lean progressive tend to be very open. Yes, of course, I'm responding to cultural ideals. And yes, I find liberalism compelling. Yes, I find, I think that the faith does have to adapt, and that God speaks to us and the Spirit speaks to us in our historical moment. They're just much more comfortable with that. In conservative spaces, there is this strong kind of myth, again, that our truth is God's truth. There's no human mediation, really. We have direct access to God's truth. Our authority structures, our hierarchies, like we have God's truth. So if you're critiquing any aspect, or even if you're just pointing out, actually, things haven't always been this way, let me show you how your position came to be, and what you call traditional actually is a very recent iteration, that is perceived as an attack. Right? That's perceived as an attack on the belief, when in fact it's just historical contextualization, which in the end doesn't decide if you're right or not. But what it does do is say you can't use the idea that this is traditional as a basis of your authority, because history is going to show there's a lot of change over time, right? So that's really what my book is doing. So with respect to gender roles, for example, complementarianism, the idea that, God has instituted patriarchal authority in the church, and then in the home, and some people extend that to society, right? There's different kind of ways that this is interpreted. At the heart, there is a theological argument there. But as a historian, I know that those passages that are used to support this complementarian system have, over the course of Christian history, been interpreted in different ways, even contradictory ways, by people who uphold the authority of the scriptures, even by people who identify as fundamentalists and as inerrantists, right? So as soon as I know that as a historian, it's not my business to say this one's right, this is God's right truth, and this one's wrong. I might have personal opinions, but actually I hold those much less rigidly than the people that I'm writing about, because I know that people have struggled to understand these over time. Instead, when I know that Bible believing Christians have interpreted these passages in different ways, my question is, Why are these people in this moment interpreting these passages in this way? Right? How can we understand that? And then we can also start to see that a lot of what is being kind of promoted as biblical womanhood, right? Biblical masculinity, in fact, has a whole lot of layers that have been added on top of any theological interpretation. So, you'll take a passage on male headship and end up that women can't be police officers, and that women need to not work outside the home, and that women need to dress a certain way, and that children need to do this, right? There's a lot of interpretation that gets added onto that. But the people who are promoting these teachings are invested in obscuring all of those layers, and the whole package they are selling as, this is God's truth, this is biblical. What historians are going to do is come in and show change over time and say this hasn't always been the case. And that's really what we do. Now, in the end, as a person of faith, as a Christian, ultimately our questions are going to come back to theology, right? But I hope as a historian that I'm able to provide some context so that we can be wiser as theologians, as pastors, as members of the body of Christ when we look at the scriptures, understanding a little bit more how we're approaching them in conversation with centuries of Christian tradition, and in conversation with our fellow Christians who may look different from us, who are situated differently from us, right? To me, this is what it is to be part of the larger body.
Yes, we have fundamentals and basic doctrines that are not negotiable, and we have this. However, I'm just shocked when I face the fact that today, many people, and not just today, the last century, especially when we had a lot of books about this kind of what means to be a man in a biblical way, and what means to be a woman in a biblical way, and they just threw their stuff to us and said, "Oh, this is dogmatic now, and you have to accept it, or you are going to hell, or you are gay and you are going to hell." And I have to admit to you that if I read your book some years ago, like 15 years ago, I would think she wants me to become a woman. And that's something I would just think, because I used to be a lot more aggressive, and I would think, what the heck? She hates John Wayne. She hates Billy Graham. I love Billy Graham. Billy Graham's my evangelical hero, and it's not this common. We have our unfortunately our evangelical idols here in Brazil, like Silas Malafaia and guys like him. Um, and I used to hear these guys before I became a reformed guy, and even later I started to receive a lot of influence from the Dutch Reformed people, and I think you were really influenced by them, right?
I am Dutch Reformed. Yeah, my mom is an immigrant from the Netherlands. My dad is a theology professor and ordained minister in the Christian Reformed Church, which is a Dutch immigrant denomination. Yes.
So, do you speak Dutch?
I don't, sadly. I speak German. I was an exchange student just across the border from the Netherlands. But Dutch was spoken by my grandparents, my mom, actually Frisian, a dialect. So yes, I'm very influenced, and I grew up in that tradition. So Abraham Kuyper, right, Herman Bavinck, Herman Dooyeweerd. These are like the people that shaped me, which means I didn't grow up in a family idolizing Billy Graham, right? Billy Graham was not one of us. And at the same time, I did grow up as part of this larger Christian world where I listened to Christian music. I listened to Christian radio, right? We had one bookstore in my small town, and it was a Christian bookstore. So all of our books, right, coming were from these evangelical publishers. And I think that's a really good example of, what is evangelicalism? Is it you attend an evangelical church? Well, maybe you're a member of a big non-denominational evangelical church, or you're part of the Southern Baptist Convention, right? Then you're clearly evangelical. But for many of us whose denominations used to be quite distinct from evangelicalism because of the influence of this popular culture and these pastor networks, now my denomination is in many cases de facto evangelical. Many churches, the majority of churches in my denomination, I would say, are essentially evangelical, and we've lost this distinctive Reformed tradition. But let me say one more thing too about your comment of, kind of feeling like I wanted to turn you into a woman. I think that what I'm describing isn't just, violence, good or bad, or what is this kind of, emasculating vision, as much as what really are the teachings of Christianity, and are we warping those or twisting those to fit our own agendas, particularly around the questions of power and violence? Because if you do look to the Christian scriptures, and if you look at the teachings of Christ, and if you look at the person of Christ, right, he was absolutely countercultural on these issues of power and violence. His followers thought, right, they were waiting for the Messiah for a very long time, and they couldn't wait because the Messiah was going to give them power, even revenge. and and then Jesus comes, and they're so excited, and then they're like, wait, this is not what we are expecting. And Jesus says that. So he rides in on a donkey, and the whole person of Jesus is one of turning on its head earthly power structures, right? It's the incarnation. God divests himself of power, becoming human. And then Jesus is the suffering servant. And, Jesus tells you what it takes to follow him is to give up your life. And this is the over and over and over again, we have teachings that are incredibly hard to live into. Love your enemies, love your neighbor as yourself, turn the other cheek, right? Put down your sword. All of this, like, I can say this, I'm a Calvinist, right? Dutch Reformed Calvinist. This goes against human nature, right? This is kind of a human nature, fallen nature. We want power. We want privilege. We want to assert our power. And it is so tempting to claim that God is on our side, whatever our agenda is, right? And that's what this ideology ends up making so possible. Allowing people to give into the temptation that what they actually want, what enhances their power, is actually what God wants for them, politically, right, socially, personally. And so what it ends up doing is distorting many of the core teachings of the gospel, the ones that are the most challenging to live into. And that's actually the corrupted of faith part of the title of my book. So in English, the subtitle is How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. And that corrupted a faith part, I thought about long and hard. I actually objected to my editor first, but then we decided to stick with it. And my objection was not because it's harsh. I'm fine with that, but because it's technically not a historical claim, right? Because what is the corruption of a faith? Historically, historians just chart change over time. We don't make kind of claims as far as what is pure and what is tainted. Corrupted of faith is a theological claim. This is not a work of theology, but I'm speaking to evangelicals on their own terms here, to Bible believing evangelicals. When I show that they have consistently neglected entire portions of the scriptures, including the teachings of Christ, by saying, turn the other cheek. No, that doesn't apply to us now because the threat is so great. But I show how there is always a threat. And if there isn't a threat, they will generate a threat. They will manufacture a threat. And so they end up really crafting a new faith, a militaristic faith, which I would argue theologically, the case could be made is a corruption of the gospel truth. Right. So that's kind of the bigger picture here. Now, does that mean that there's no right for a nation to defend itself? Pacifists will say absolutely the faithful interpretation of the scriptures is pacifism. I'm challenged by that interpretation, but I think you can also say, no, there are situations where it is okay to defend yourself. But what happens inside evangelical spaces and conservative American spaces is that you always justify your own aggression, no matter what, because of an imagined threat. And I show in the book over and over again is how this sense of threat is frequently fabricated. It's manufactured. Like the case of these ex-Muslim terrorists who are total frauds, but take the speaking circuit by storm post 9/11 with stories about how they were out to kill Christians and American Christians, American evangelicals until they were converted. And they're all the rage. Everybody's sponsoring these guys. One of them came to my own institution, sponsored by Focus on the Family. Truth is, all these guys, total frauds, making it all up. And the evangelical supporters, like Focus on the Family, knew they were frauds and still sponsored them, right? That's what I'm talking about. What is going on here? This is not about truth. And we also have so many commands in the gospel. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid, right? My kingdom is not of this world. And that is what is being lost here.
Yes, it's really hard to live it in a government, with such a military power. And, the US is the greatest military power in the world right now. And it's just too hard, Kristin. It's just too hard. And I almost totally agree with you. Some stuff you said, I cannot agree because my English is not so good. Just kidding. I was just preparing this joke. But I almost totally agree with you in many ways, and I know this. I know this is hard. It's hard to live this stuff, and I think that if I was someone in the government, a president or anything like this, I know that maybe I would just go another way for mistake. Maybe. I know this is difficult. The most famous case of imaginary threat, I believe, is the mass destruction weapons in Iraq. Man, sorry, I said man. I usually say man, but professor. This is just incredible how they fabricated that. They imagined that, and a lot of people were killed. Yeah, and this is very, very unbiblical. Very unbiblical. I know our time is just running away from us, just flowing, but I have some questions for you, and looks like I'm changing the subject, but I'm not changing the subject. What do you think about Jordan Peterson?
So if you read carefully, you saw Jordan Peterson did get a little shout out at the end of the book, right? And I was going back and forth. Do I put him in? Do I not put him in? Do I put him in? And then I ended up keeping him in. I asked my editor, like, should I keep him in? He's like, yeah, let's keep him in. He's an example. The reason he's in there is because he's another great example of not a Christian, at least when I was writing the book, right? Very clearly, he did not identify as Christian. Now, whether or not he's had some sort of conversion experience, what that looks like in the last couple of years, I'll leave that be. But he's a really great example of how so many evangelicals are drawn to secular figures who are promoting cultural values, political values that they really like, rather than finding unity in faith commitments, right? And then letting holding together across political or cultural or racial differences, right? And so he was this kind of clear example of I was watching just like kind of the secular model of John Wayne embraced by conservative evangelicals. I saw the same, and we could talk about Donald Trump as well, right? Not a Christian, maybe, arguably not even a baby Christian, as James Dobson claimed, but comes to stand as this kind of figurehead, as God's anointed. Somehow, God is doing God's work through this person who is actually outside of the faith. Jordan Peterson is another example that just shows how cultural and political allegiances end up displacing unity in Christ and theological allegiance.
Right. That is something I feel that Peterson speaks a lot about stuff that we, the Christians, are not speaking enough. And that's why I think people like him very much. I like him very much. I do not agree with him in a lot of ways because he's not a Christian and he doesn't know a lot about the Christian faith. And but that's it. He speaks a lot about stuff I would like to hear some other Christian men talking about. Some stuff that I talk here in my church, the church where I am a pastor, and but that's it. This is a problem. We elected some figures, some people that are not Christians, and it should be our representatives, like Donald Trump, like John Wayne, like Jordan Peterson, like I don't know who else in the United States, but we have a lot of this new movement here in Brazil, and this worries me a lot. We have good people here in Brazil speaking about stuff we need to hear, like Iago Martins, and like some other guys, Victor Fontana, and even the most influential Reformed pastors in Brazil, Hernandes Dias Lopes and Augustus Nicodemus. I don't know if you know them, but Augustus Nicodemus is a very famous one. And the last question about a person that is not yourself. What's your opinion on John Piper? I love John Piper. He's such
Yeah. Okay. Well,
the
first,
grandfather of the nation right now.
first, let me say that that I don't want to suggest that people who are not Christian don't have truth to share, right? That's absolutely not true. That goes against kind of my religious framework and understanding of common grace and so on. So I want to clarify that. I think though that what I would encourage is that we resist the kind of seductive pull of some of these frameworks that are identifying problems and offering solutions that both the problems they identify might be faulty and the solutions they're proposing may do more harm than good, right? So definitely, I'm the mom to a teenage boy, and I'm very sensitive to arguments that it's hard to be a man and to grow up into manhood. um but then I would change kind of the discourse in a lot of ways. Is part of what makes it so difficult is because we have these faulty models of manhood that we hold up and we continue to prop up, that are not actually true to who God created people to be, right? Are we that reinforce this kind of binary that most men don't actually match up with very well. The solutions that are proposed to empower boys, do they do harm to women, to girls? Are these models in this country in particular, are they neglecting racial differences, right? So if you want to look at, is it difficult to be a boy growing up to be a man? Yes. And then especially so for certain boys more than for others, right? And so we need to be able to have these conversations in ways that are not just all or nothing, but don't just kind of glom onto this influencer or that influencer and say they have all the answers, and forget that we have the scriptures, we have a longer Christian tradition, we have a community, and we can test these ideas much more responsibly, and we have a more holistic understanding of human flourishing for women, for men, for all followers of Christ, right? So that's what I would say to that. John Piper. John Piper would be, I think, a really good example of somebody who actually many of my beliefs core theological beliefs align with John Piper's core theological beliefs. At the same time, I think it's fair to say John Piper would, I don't know where he is, like, in terms of, he hasn't been speaking a lot recently kind of into some of these conversations, but by elevating complementarianism to the height that he did, I'm not sure if he would recognize me as a sister in Christ, to be honest, right? And maybe he would, but the system that he structured was one that excluded anybody who was not complementarian, certainly anybody who challenged complementarianism. And so by elevating complementarianism to like this orthodoxy, what that ended up doing, and this is a story I tell in the book, not just with John Piper, but he's certainly one of them, is anybody who kind of aligns with that school of thought is good, right? They get the platforms at the conferences. That's who we want out there. People like Doug Wilson, arguably extremely racist, arguably misogynistic. Or I say arguably because I would argue that, but other people could contest. Those guys are somehow all okay. Anybody who is, upholding the Nicene Creed, evangelizing core Christian truths, but identifies as egalitarian, not welcome in those spaces. So what happens then over the years? That anybody to this side, as long as they uphold masculine authority as scriptural, they're cool. They also happen to uphold racial hierarchies. They also have a really hard time calling out abuse. In fact, it's almost impossible inside these systems to call out abuse of women, sexual abuse. This is how we see the patterns, right, play out over the last 20, 30 years. John Piper is a part of that. He has made his own comments on abuse of women, and these teachings just take hold, and voices of those who, even if he differs with them on theological interpretation here or there, aren't even allowed around the table. And so what we have then is evangelicalism, conservative Christianity pulled to the right, not just on gender, but on a whole slate of other issues. So that's the pattern that I'm pointing to. So again, I would find a lot of unity theologically with John Piper, with some important differences. But would that even matter, right? Inside those spaces, the way certainly that many of the men inside those spaces have responded to me suggests no, that there are certain things that actually matter more to them than unity around the core teachings of the historic Christian faith.
Sure. Now there's a lot more that I would like to ask, but I know our time is at the end. Kristin, I'm so sad to say it ended now, but now time just ended, and I know you have other other interviews and other stuff to do. I hope your book, and not only your book, this book, but your books, I hope you can sell a lot of them, and people can read what you said and what you say and what you think and what you saw. I think this is very important. It's very important to me, and I hope this is very important to other people too. Um, just one comment. I like John Piper. Many of those things he says, the bad things he says, doesn't make it to Brazil, and this it's just normal. It's just normal because we are another country. But it was a pleasure and it was an honor, and I hope we can repeat this. We'll read your book, and you will talk to Beth Barr, and I hope that I will listen to this, and I hope that God wants to that we can have Beth here. Um, this is it. We are ending right now. Book will just
All right. Well,
say
let me say thank you to you too,
Oh,
and thank you
please.
for hosting this conversation, and particularly right as you identify as a complementarian, so important to me, and I am incredibly grateful to all of the conservative complementarian pastors and believers who have engaged my work in such good faith, because in the United States, there's a lot of the kind of more hostile responses have played out more prominently on social media, right, where a few powerful voices have really tried to attack me and my work. And I get that draws a lot of attention, but I am incredibly grateful to what is actually the norm, which is that many evangelical men themselves, including many complementarian men, are responding to the book in exactly the way I would have hoped, which is, not saying I agree with everything necessarily, but saying there is truth here and we need to grapple with this together, right? And that to me is just all I can ask for. And so I'm particularly grateful to people like you who are engaging the work and who are holding it up for others to also respond to in such good faith. So thank you very much.
Yes, we are brethren, as the Bible says, and this is really good. I know that what unites us is bigger than what divides us, and the great problem in the U.S. is that you are too many, many evangelicals, many Protestants, many kind of Christians. In Brazil, we are not this much, and we have to hold to each other. We are really divided here in Brazil.
Yes.
But this is it. I really loved reading your book. I hope to read your first book, and I hope to learn. But I won't let my wife read it. I'm just kidding. I hope she reads it too and she likes you. Talita is Book's wife, and she's some kind of egalitarian, and some ways she's a complementarian too. You would love to talk to her, but she doesn't speak English. That's it, Kristin. Please, we are ending now, but stay with us a little more, and
Sure.
we just share a couple of words, and you can be free and give your other interviews. That's it. Book will finish now, and God bless you. God bless you a lot. O Book é com você agora, meu amigo.
Thank you so much.
Ok, isso aí. Beleza, galera. Muito obrigado, professora. Muito obrigado a vocês, nossos queridos ouvintes, que conseguiram ficar conosco até o final. Espero que vocês tenham gostado, que tenha sido legal para você esse tempo. Uma conversa muito relevante. Muito obrigado, professora Kristin Du Mez. Obrigado por receber, aceitar, o nosso convite. Que Deus continue abençoando a sua vida. Valeu, Tiago. Valeu, galera. Abraço e até o nosso próximo episódio do Admirável Novo Podcast Brasileiro. Valeu!
Valeu, Buquinho. Um abraço hétero para você. Até mais.
Abraço.